The final shape ability tuning preview. This is going to be a long one, so I'm just going to jump right into it. Starting off with stasis. Stasis will now have a new keyword item called Frost Armor. Frost Armor will be a stacking buff that will be applied to you when you pick up stasis shards or do things with exotic armor, certain fragments, aspects, that kind of deal. Per stack of Frost Armor, you will get a 4.5% damage reduction in PvE and a 2% damage reduction in PvP, and the max stacks you can have is 5 by default. You will be able to increase your maximum amount of stacks you can hold as well as how long those last with Whisper of Rhyme, where every time you collect a stasis shard, it will grant you above the maximum stacks by default up to 8, and it will also give you more duration on those stacks, with it increasing it from 9 seconds to 13 seconds. So Whisper of Rhyme is actually pretty essential now. Frost Armor does work with your supers, but it is significantly reduced after it is cast. So you do still need to be very mindful of how much damage you're taking in your super, but it's a little easier to live now, which is nice. They have added a new functionality to all harvest aspects, where you will have both small and large stasis shards. When you pick up these shards, instead of just giving you melee energy, they're actually going to give you a bit of health and a bit of frost armor, and depending on the shard determines how much health and how much frost armor you get. To make sure people in trials don't just run triple behemoth and ride each other's dick, they've made it so that cooldowns will be shared across the fire team that you're in for stasis shards, especially the large ones, so that you can't abuse the system. They've also made it so that Titans can now shatter an enemy and get a stasis shard and not just crystals, so you can actually, play the game. Got some exotic reworks on the tail end of this as well, where Renewal Grasps will actually be granting you frost armor as you stand in the bubble. When you throw it down, it will grant 1 stack of frost armor to everybody that's in the vicinity when it pops, and then if you stand in it, every 1 second you will get an additional stack of frost armor, as well as resetting your timer. So it's really good, I'd say, in damage phases, throwing it at your feet, and you'll be able to just have passive damage reduction, because we'll get into it later, you're gonna probably need a bit more survivability in DPS phases now. You'll figure out why in a bit. Balador's Wrathweavers is kind of getting the same treatment as Renewal Grasps, where instead of just getting Overshield, when you cast your Rift, you will actually get some Frost Armor, and your Winter's Wrath Shatter attack will also give you Frost Armor. So, pretty good all around. They've added 2 new fragments as well as reworking a couple of other ones, so I'm just going to list through them real fast. New fragment, Whisper of Chill, where Stasis Weapon Final Blows will have a chance to create a Stasis Shard. Whisper of Chains has been changed, so instead of granting passive damage reduction, you now have a chance to create a Stasis Shard every time you defeat an enemy while you have Frost Armor. Whisper of Fractures will no longer increase melee energy regen when surrounded by enemies. Instead, it will now grant a stack of Frost Armor when you shatter any frozen target with a melee attack. That is interesting because it actually forces you to change your playstyle. Fragments don't usually do that, so I'm actually very intrigued by that. Whisper of Torment has gotten a rework where instead of depending on your current health value, it'll just give you flat energy based on the amount of damage you take, as well as giving you more energy if you are hit while you have Frost Armor. So they've actually bumped it from 7 to 12% while you have Frost Armor, and 5 to 7 at base. That's a lot of grenade energy to be getting just for taking damage. There better be a pretty lengthy cooldown, or else there's going to be massive stasis nade spam. And on to our final fragment, we have Whisper of Reversal. While you have Frost Armor, taking melee damage will cause the target to be slowed or even frozen. Moving on from the fragments, they have touched up the stasis shatter damage a bit by doubling it. They increased base PvE shatter damage from 200 to 400, so you can expect some better damage if you are running shatter-based builds. Now we have some touch-ups for every class. Warlocks, you are first. Ice Flare Bolts increase maximum number of Seekers created before going on cooldown from 5 to 7. Pretty nice. Hunters, you are doing pretty good as well. Winter Shroud is getting a new aspect of it, where slowing targets will briefly increase your class ability regen rate, and it will also give you damage reduction when you activate it, and that is reduced in PvP, of course. Touch of Winter is also getting a bit of a touch-up. Glacial Nades will now spawn 1 additional crystal, as well as being formed over the course of 0.27 seconds instead of instantly. That's to stop it from potentially crashing games, or it being fucking weird and not working. So, pretty cool. Cold Snap Grenades will no longer chain an additional time. Instead, Seekers will now duplicate when they freeze a target, and they have changed it so instead of generating a small crystal, it will generate a large crystal. Silence and Squall has been changed. It's basically had its damage and slow tick rate increased by 40%. That's a pretty big bump, so I'll definitely have to retest it later. And they've also increased the maximum travel speed by 10%, so it will move faster, so it can actually hit things. Titans, you are last. With your Shiver Strike, your big punchy punch, will now have better hit registration, do more damage, and increased lunge as well. So that's fun for you, I guess. Can't wait to see that in the Crucible. Cryoclasm is also getting a change. The big slide that Titans get, that sprint time requirement has been removed. Now it will just have a 4-second cooldown every time you do a funny slide. That's it for the stasis changes, and now we are on to the biggest piece of news in the past year or two, I would say. Well of Radiance and Word of Dawn are both getting nerfs, and they are not small. Holy shit. Let's start with Well first. Well has basically had its healing per second halved, its damage resistance halved, it's easier to break the well now, and the only sort of buffs it got were now you get Radiant for 8 seconds when you leave the well, and when you cast it, it does 300 healing. So the best you can do is cast it at the start of a damage phase and actually have to move the fuck around, because it hurts to stand in the well now. You can't just sit there and do nothing. It will actually be a pain in the ass to do damage now, which I personally find to be a good thing, because holy shit, Well of Radiance makes things so boring. So goddamn boring. Nezarec, stand in a well. Rolk, stand in a well and get kicked around for fucking 2 minutes. Riven, stand in a well and swing swords. It's all just well. Finally, Warlocks have options. You guys have had viable supers for more than 3 years now. It's not like they're garbage. It's just that well was so good that you weren't allowed to use anything else. Now you can. Oh my god, it is the liberation of Warlocks. They have been freed. I cannot wait to see the absolute shitstorm on Twitter over this, because there are so many people that have been crutching on Well for so long that they don't know how to play the game. And this will genuinely make people better because they can't crutch on it so hard. So I'm so ready for the final shape, and I'm so ready for that raid where we kick the shit out of the Witness and I don't have to use a well. Thank Christ. Moving on from the earth-shattering patch that was Well, we have Word of Dawn, and I would say this is more of a PvP-focused change because Bubble has been just ruining Trials for so long. So they have effectively removed Armor of Light's Overshield. Now it will just have Full Void Overshield, so it's weaker and it regenerates less fast. So thank God for that. Armor of Light instead will now grant you damage resistance while you are inside the Word of Dawn, 30% versus enemy players and 60% versus enemy combatants. TLDR, you can now punch somebody in a Word of Dawn without instantly dying. That's all well and good, but we lost something along the way. You will no longer have Weapons of Light by default. That will be moved to the Helm of Saint 14. I am kind of not okay with that. I feel like Weapons of Light by itself isn't good enough to warrant just using an exotic purely for that benefit. As much as I just dogged on Well earlier, the damage buff for Well is just better because you don't need an exotic to get that damage buff. That kind of fucking sucks. But that's kind of it for the big ticket items. I'm just going to run through the rest of all the tiny little stuff that they did to the rest of the classes, starting with Arc. Hunters, your arc staffs will now have blinding effects when you do the heavy combo or the air slam. Disorienting Blow has had its cooldown reduced from 100 to 90 seconds, and Tempest Strike now has damage resistance when activated. Warlocks, your Lightning Surge will have damage resistance as well, and your Ball Lightning Melee will now have better tracking. Titans, your Thunderclap just got a damage bump across the board against everything, and your Knockout has had increased bonus damage as well from 25 to 50%. That is fucking insane. However, they did change the healing, where now instead of getting regen, you just get a flat chunk of health every punch. Arc Grenades as a whole are getting a damage buff. Storm Grenades by 20%, Skip Grenades by 15%, and Arc Bolts also by 15%. So those will all be more viable with that damage buff as well. That's outside of Touch of Thunder. That is just base kit, so everybody gets those buffs. Finishing up Arc with some Arc Fragment tuning. Spark of Recharge will now persist up until you are fully healed, not just when your shield starts recharging, so that's a big uptime bump for Spark of Recharge. Spark of Beacons will now proc with heavy ammo weapons, and to quote the TWAB, time to break out the Thunderlord. And Spark of Frequency will be giving you a bit of a stability and reload speed bump every time you do a powered melee attack. That's it for Arc. On to Solar. Hunters, you are up first. Lightweight Knife will now have 2 melee charges and you can throw them faster. Knock 'em Down has reduced internal cooldown for throwing knives from 1 second to 0.2 seconds, so basically no cooldown. It makes it so that if you were throwing your knives a little too fast, you wouldn't lose them immediately. 3-shot Golden Gun has had a bit of a nerf to its Orbs of Power, where now orbs generated by 3-shot are less potent, so you can't just have infinite chains of 3-shot golden guns anymore. Moving on from Hunters, we have Titans. Consecration will now shatter stasis crystals. It will now deal 20% increased damage on its ignition, and it has PvE damage resistance. And Swarm Grenades now do 20% more damage, last longer, and have better tracking. And that will be it for Solar. On to Void. Hunters, you are up first with changes to your Snare Bomb. Base Kit Snare Bomb has had their duration increased from 3 to 5 seconds, and it will now grant a stacking damage over time bonus while they are stuck in the smoke. Stylish Executioner will now proc the weaken effect on glaive attacks, and that will be all for Hunters. Moving on to Titans. Your Shield Throw will now just be better. It does 20% more damage, has better tracking, and can survive more bounces and last longer in the air. So it's just better now in every way. Offensive Bulwark has gotten some changes where instead of what it used to do, it will now just regenerate a small portion of your active Void Overshield with each melee kill instead of just doing random timer bullshit. Done with Titans, now onto Warlocks, starting with Handheld Supernova, or basically what it's supposed to be. When you use Chaos Accelerant with a magnetic grenade, it turns it into Handheld Supernova. What they've done is buffed it a shit ton. It will now have better physics tracking, increased damage by 20% in PvE, and while Chaos Accelerant is equipped, it will have 10% faster recharge time. So in general, Handheld Supernova is back, at least in PvE, because it's gonna be pretty fucking good with Controverse holds. Pocket Singularity also got a bit of a buff, just a small amount of 50% damage increase, so just a tiny bit. And Nova Bombs have had some tuning as well. Cataclysm has had their Seeker count increased from 4 to 6, and they will no longer explode immediately when you throw the Nova Bomb. They'll actually work. And Vortex has had its duration increased from 7 to 10. So even though Nova Bomb is still technically the worst super in the entire game, at least they're trying to buff it. Done with Void, now we're on to our final subclass, that being Strand. Threat of Warding has had its duration reduced from 10 seconds to 5 seconds. That's pretty rough. Now, over time, a lot of the Strand subclasses have gotten aspects to give them more survivability than they used to, but that still hurts for a lot of reasons. Now, this doesn't really apply to hunters that much because we have Sardorechnus, whatever the fuck you call it, facade. That just gives us unlimited uptime on Woven Mail, so we don't really have to worry about that. But for Warlock specifically, that's a big deal. Your survivability on Warlock on Strand isn't that good, since, you know, Titans kind of have the whole Banner of War thing, which we'll get to in a minute. They definitely nerf that shit bad. But yeah, this is a really bad nerf. This is gonna hurt a lot. Hunters, you are up first. Your ensnaring slam has been adjusted, so instead of it being a circle around you when you slam, it will now be sort of a cylinder with a 6.5 meter radius. This should make it a lot easier to use in the Crucible as well as PvE, as you will be able to slam on more enemies at once. Threaded Spike has also had a bit of a nerf in the Crucible. It was just doing too much damage, so they nerfed it from 79 to 70, so now it'll be less oppressive. Warlocks, you really only have one thing changed in regards to Strand, and that will be Weaver's Call, where defeating targets with Strand damage will give you perched threadlings, and the higher tier that enemy is, the more threadlings you get. And it can even proc off of other threadlings, so your threadlings can generate more threadlings. So that's a pretty big buff, I'd say. Titans, your time has come. Banner of War has been nerfed by a decent bit. They've reduced the maximum timer from 30 to 24, and they've reduced damage across the board. Melees, glaives, supers, the whole deal. And they will now have diminishing returns with Wormgod Caress. Banner of War is still pretty good for the healing and the survivability, but as far as damage is concerned, it's maybe like a 20% buff instead of a 40% buff now. And that will do it for this video. That has been all of the relevant ability tuning changes coming in the final shape. How do you guys feel about it? I think that that well nerf is actually going to be amazing because I can do something other than play well. So I'm having a pretty good time already. Anyways, that'll be all from me. Thank you so much for watching. Do all the algorithm stuff, like, subscribe, comment, I don't care, do whatever you want. But yep, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys later. Goodbye.